Well, we're going to do some learning together on the Parsha to come. A reminder or a teaching for those who may or may not be aware that the Parsha divisions come after the whole canonized 5-book text of the Torah. And chapter divisions are a much later Christian addition. So when we look at the division of where things end and where things begin, especially when we're in the middle of a story, like the story of the life of Sarah, it's interesting to think about the intention of whoever made that editorial decision to break at a particular point. For example, here at the beginning of a new Parsha, a new Torah portion, that decision was made by a rabbinic council, so to speak, right? By the elders of a post-closed canon. These are the 5 books, but here's how we're going to divide it. And the division that they chose to make was a division that has us beginning the story of Chayyei Sarah, the parasha, with the end of Sarah's life. So we begin the parsha with the death based on the decision of not the Torah as it was handed down from Moshe, but in the literary hands of our teachers and our leaders. So we have to imagine that there's something to teach us in that idea, in that notion. And a lot of ink has been spilled, and a lot of people have begun their drashot on Chayyei Sarah by saying, what an interesting thing that a parasha that would be named Chayyei Sarah would be about the death of Sarah, because Chayyei, of course, means life. It's Chayyei, missing its chaser, it's missing its mem, but is basically the internal parts or the first half of Chayyim, and is about the life of Sarah. But when translated properly, I think, or when translated very literally, the verse that begins our parsha, or the verse that we start out from in this story in our parsha, is Vayihiyu, and so were Chayyei Sarah, the lifespan of Sarah. So Chayyei were like the lived life years of Sarah. So really it's a lifespan more than it is life. Chayyei Sarah, two nouns, one describing the other. We're going to get to a story about the significance of Sarah's death and what it must have heralded. But I'd like to give us the context that as a rabbi who works with many different families who come from different traditions when it comes to naming the next generation, I'm aware of the enormous amount of superstition and importance and weight attached to who gets named after whom. And I think that's relevant to what we're about to explore. Because when we think about the end of a life of an elder in a family, we're already thinking about their legacy and who continues after them. In Ashkenazi tradition, the highest honor that can be given to a person in terms of naming is that a child is named after them when? When's the honor given? According to normative Eastern European traditions. So in death, one is honored after their death. One is honored after their death by having someone named after them. In most traditions, central to at least fairly recent tracing back to Spain and Portugal, so we'll call them like centrist Sephardic traditions, the naming rite is that the highest honor one can receive in being named after someone is when someone is named after them in life. In life. I have both in my family. My mom's sister married a man from Egypt. Some of you who've known me for a decade or more have known me to tell this story many times, that my mom and dad are both from entirely Ashkenazi families, but my mom's sister married a man who's the youngest of 6, who escaped Cairo under the reign of Nasir some 50 plus years ago, 60 years ago now. And in their family, that tradition of naming after the living is profound and strong. And there are quite a few people who carry the same names as one another, because being one of 6, there are many, many children in the family. And so many people want to do the honor, the zechut, the merit to that living person. So there are lots of people who carry the same names within the family. And in my family, apart from the Egyptian piece of the family, everyone else sort of names after the deceased. In the conception of the ancient rabbis, naming is like a tiny little fraction of the honor that sort of leaves from one person's legacy into another person's legacy. I want you to imagine the emotional power of naming one person after another, whether alive or deceased, and multiply that many, many, many times over, right? Many-fold power, to imagine what the rabbinic conception, looking back at the story of Sarah, and then who are our next generations? Sarah, Rivka, and then Rachel and Leah are the next generation together. As we go from generation to generation, the notion of the potency and the spirituality and the concentration of who is carrying the mantle of our people as matriarchs alone was so intense and so strong that the rabbis conceived of it way beyond anything that we speak about to this day. Today, if I were to say to you that somebody is the living embodiment or personification of all the power amongst a people or in another time or a place, you might think that I was speaking about, I don't know, what living example do we have of that? What living example do we have of someone who just by dint of their birth in the contemporary, let's say, Western world, just by dint of their birth, something new is born in the world? And something powerful is happening because of the legacy and the chain of command in that family. Anybody here follow the royal family in England?
I don't follow it.
Some people have a great affinity and a love, or even like what do they call Britophiles, right? People who like really, people who really, with a great accent. I think that gives us then still a fraction of, but a better idea and a conception of what it meant, because we're not talking about the descendants of a monarchy. It's much bigger. Much bigger, because we're not talking about who's sitting as head judge or on a throne. We're talking about who is the matriarch and who's at the head of a people. And it's in that context that I want to study one take on one part of this verse. And before we can go there, we have to look at a verse in Kohelet, in Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is not typically a part of our liturgical canon. Once a year, we bring it into the synagogue during the holiday of Sukkot. We study the notions inherent to Ecclesiastes, to Kohelet, about the fragility and potentially existential crises that could be conceived of and are conceived of in the book of, like, based on the words in the book of Ecclesiastes. But most of the time, we call this, we look to Ecclesiastes and call this formally something called wisdom literature. Why is that important before I even tell you what this verse is? Because wisdom literature is typically not the source of halacha, or understanding for the way that Jewish law, customs, and reasons come about. Wisdom literature is meant to be exactly what it sounds like. A book of Proverbs, a book of, pithy is unfair to wisdom literature, but a book that guides an ethos and an ethic of a people, not necessarily a book that's read in depth in order to learn the way that one practices from day to day. So it's actually somewhat rare to see our Talmudic sages, 600 CE thereabouts, right? I say más o menos, because by the 600, we've got this complete collection of living spoken Talmud, but 600 is when that canon of Talmud comes to a close. And by the time that canon comes to a close, we don't see much of Ecclesiastes referenced as the guide to how Jews are learning to live their life day to day. But it plays a big role in the following Talmud that we're going to read together. So the verse is from the first chapter of Kohelet, of Ecclesiastes, the 5th verse. V'zarach hashemesh uva hashemesh ve'el mekomo sho'ef zoreach hu sham. It's poetic, miniature tikpolet, miniature parallelism. V'zarach hashemesh uva hashemesh. You can hear that there's a rhythm because there are two similar parallel verbs to each other. And the sun rises and the sun sets. And back to its place it goes. Zoreach Husham, that's where it goes and shines forth or rises. The rabbis take this verse and learn from it something far beyond what the plain read of our text would tell us about the death of Sarah. And we're going to look at that now. The payoff is in paying attention to this long line of stories, and I'm going to take you through it. This commentary, this starts from Bereshit Rabbah. It's a journey to get there. This is Bereshit Rabbah, a very old midrash, and this Bereshit Rabbah is going to feed into the Talmud that we look at. Here's the story. Bereshit Rabbah starts by bringing in a quote from Kohelet, the one that we just read. V'zarach hashemesh uva hashemesh, Amar Rabbi Abba bar Kahana. This old ancient rabbi, Abba bar Kahana, he came and said, V'chi ein anu yodein shezarach hashemesh uva hashemesh. Don't we know that the sun rises and it sets? In other words, why do we have to be told this? Ella ad shelo yashkia hakadosh baruch hu, shimsho shel tzadik hu mazriach shimsho shel tzadik chavero, yom shemet. Rabbi Akiva nolad Rabbeinu, v'kara'u alav v'zarach hashemesh uva hashemesh. Rather, this saying from the wisdom literature comes to teach us that before the Kadosh Baruch Hu, God, causes the sun of a righteous person, the sun as in the shemesh, of a righteous person to set. Before a righteous person passes away, the Holy One brings into the world the person who will take their place as a tzaddik in this world, a righteous person in this world. And immediately launches into an example, presumably in the voice of Rabbi Abba bar Kahana, who says, the day that Rabbi Akiva, whom we know, who died a martyr, the day that he died, Rabbeinu, Yehuda HaNasi, was born. And they applied this particular teaching to that death and that birth. Well, the sun has set and the sun has risen. Who has the sun set on? On Rabbi Akiva. And now it's risen on Yehuda HaNasi. And who does Yehuda HaNasi become? The editor and conveyor of the Mishnah, right? Incredibly important, not a matriarch of our people, but an extraordinarily important person. And so the Midrash carries forward with a series of stories like this. Rav Ada bar Ahava was born, and they applied this verse in his regard. On the day that Rav Ada bar Ahava died, Rabbi Avun was born, and they applied this verse in his regard. On the day that Rabbi Avun died, his son Rabbi Avun was born. On the day that Rabbi Avun died, Abba Hoshai of Teria was born. On the day Abba Hoshea died, Rabbi Hoshea was born, and they applied this verse before he caused Moses' sun to set. So pausing on that notion, I was just launching because I like the poeticism of the series before you get back to Moshe. So lived experience. Rab Abi Bar Hahana says, I know this because I've seen it. I know this because we've told the stories. The day that a tzaddik, a truly righteous person, an important and righteous person among us, passes away, even that same day, the person taking over is born. I'm not going to stop and dwell on the emotional toil and trauma, of course, of the fact that we're hearing these stories of sons who died on the day that their father, who were born on the day that their father died. Right? That is in and of itself, whether it's a parable or a story, that's terribly sad. But that's not the point of our learning at the moment. The point of our learning at the moment is to see that there was such hopefulness in the world because a great person had died, but a tzaddik, a new great and righteous person, came into the world. So that's Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana's proof text, right? And then he says, but even if you go back to the Torah, even if you go all the way back to the Torah, Ad Vayomer Adonai al Moshe. Let's see. Moshe. Ad shelo hishkia shimsho shel Moshe, hizriach shimsho shel Yoshua. Before Moshe died, of course, who do we meet? Joshua. And Joshua is going to take up the mantle. He's the next tzaddik in line. And we get a proof text for that Shenemar. And then Ad shelo shaka shimsho shel Yoshua, zarcha shimsho shel Atniel ben Kenaz. And he becomes the next one. Ad shelo shaka shimsho shel Eli, zarcha shimsho shel Shmuel. Before Eli, and who is Eli? Eli, the priest whom we meet in the beginning of the book of Shmuel. Before his sun sets, we meet Shmuel. Okay? And then we get to Rabbi Yochanan said, actually skip the Rabbi Yochanan teaching because I don't have time to get into the like a calf without blemish, but his beautiful teaching. Before the Holy One, blessed be God. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Shimsha shel Sarah. Who's Sarah? Sarah Imenu. Is this text in chronological order? No, it's a mess. It's not in chronological order even a little bit. Because first we're in the contemporary times of Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana, who's telling this story, and it's captured in the Midrash. Then he says, wait, hang on, I can go back even further. I can tell you Moshe and Joshua, etc., etc. But of course, Moshe and Joshua, are they before or after Sarah? Way after. Many generations, a whole enslavement, hundreds and hundreds of years, according to our Torah, right? And now he's gone back in time and said, but even before all this, and this is how the text ends, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shimsha shel Sarah, Hizirach Shimsha shel Rivka. Before Sarah's sun set, the Shemesh of Rivka rose. What's meant by this? Now that we've gone through it, what do you understand from this? Before the sun, what does it mean that before Sarah's sun set?
Before Sarah died.
Before she died, Rivka. There must have been a replacement for her, Marshall says. There must have been a replacement for the, let's call it, for the sunlight, the righteous sunlight in the world, right? This is the image that this text is giving us. Before the sunlight of Sarah could leave from flooding and brightening, let's say, the world. I like the imagery of the Shemesh, though, of course, it comes directly from Kohelet, so I'm really reading into it. But I like that brightness of life. Before that light would go out, new light needed to come into the world, and that light was Rivka. And who, of course, was Rivka to Sarah? She's the daughter, exactly. She becomes the daughter. No, you got there. You were there. I saw it. It was the daughter-in-law. Exactly. She becomes the daughter-in-law. And why is she so important to our story at the moment when she becomes the daughter-in-law? Because Sarah is not there. And what happens with Avraham in the story that we're reading this week and next? What does Avraham do? He sets about doing something. Yeah, he says, I can't die until my son has a partner. And it's got to be someone who can carry this forward. Rivka wasn't already in the story. We haven't met her in that regard, but she's there to take over and already exist in the world. It's her light that comes to shine and join up with Isaac, right, with Yitzchak, and becomes the new center of the universe in a heliocentric sense, right? In the notion of the sun being at the center of the universe. Sarah is no longer the center of the universe. Instead, Rivka becomes the matriarchal center of the Jewish universe. Everyone with me up until this point? Wonderful. Great. Let's go to Yoma in the Talmud. So Bereshit Rabbah, what we were reading before, were ancient stories, midrashim, told by the rabbis, captured and then begun to be referenced in the early literature that's pre-Mishnah. So by the end of, by the time we get to one of the Common Era, 2,000 years ago, we already have several very old collections of midrashim, Bereshit Rabbah among them, and it gets brought in to many, many places later by 200 CE when we have the Mishnah, by 600 CE when we have the Talmud. Yoma is going to look back at this teaching and teach us something that goes a little bit extra, a little beyond, a little more parable. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Chiya bar Abba wanted to quote Rabbi Yochanan in a teaching that said, Ein tzaddik niftar, a righteous person doesn't die or depart from min ha'olam, from the world, ad shenivra tzaddik kimoto, until another righteous person is made kimoto. What is kimoto? Like him. But of course, it's a little bit of a play on words. Why? Kimoto. It sounds like in our oral tradition. This is my take. This is Rabbi Hillary Chorny's take on it, not Steinsaltz or not the Talmud itself. I think in an oral tradition, it would have been a very clever saying, because kimoto is not just like them, but also like their death. So I think it's a play on words a little bit from this parable and this teaching that would have been known from the wisdom literature of Ecclesiastes, of Kohelet, and of course passed on by this Bereshit, this midrash from Bereshit that people perhaps knew, this notion. Perhaps it was even a superstition. I didn't do a deep dive, but in the ancient world, I imagine there was a notion that when a righteous person was about to die, people were looking around to see who is the tzaddik who is taking their place in the sunshine in the world, so to speak. Very possible. So he has this saying, which seems like a contemporized, sort of updated notion based on this teaching from Kohelet, from Ecclesiastes, and goes on to say, Shne'emar, and quote our verse, V'zarach hashemesh uvah hashemesh, ad shelo kavta shimsho shel Eli, zarcha shimsho shel Shmuel haramati. He brings the example that one of the many examples brought in Bereshit Rabbah, before Eli the priest passed away. Of course, we have Shmuel brought into this world, and he is able to sort of take that place. And then Rabbi Chiya bar Abba, remember, Rabbi Chiya bar Abba is quoting Rabbi Yochanan, bringing this is his teacher's Rabbi Yochanan. He says, and Rabbi Yochanan would tell a story here. Ra'ah HaKadosh Baruch Hu shetzadikim muatin, amad ushtalan bechol dor vador, shene'emar ki ladonai metzukei eretz, vayashet alehem tevel. So what he says is, he saw the God. Rabbi Chiya bar Abba tells in the name of his teacher, Rabbi Yochanan, that what must have happened, what he knows, what he's heard, he doesn't quote any verse, he just says what he's heard, is that God realized that the garden of people, so to speak, was lacking in righteous people. It was looking sparse, right, and as sort of empty. So what did God do? God arose and planted in every generation somebody to take the next place. Beautifully said, because of course we see that there has to be a planting of that seed in order for each of these generations to take over. Because in Bereshit Rabbah, the conception is literally these people are being born on the day that the tzaddikim are dying. But the broader notion in rabbinic texts that survives in the Talmud is not that on the day that I die, someone righteous will be born, but rather someone righteous already exists in the world, just like with Rivka and Sarah. Well, when the light of a righteous person leaves this world, that there is another righteous person to go forth and take over that light. And what a beautiful idea that God is going about to, when God sees that the supply is a bit low on righteous people in God's garden on this earth, God plants some more righteous people. And then, of course, there's a quote from a text, in this case from Shmuel, which is interesting because that's also where the reference to Eli and Shmuel comes from earlier in this teaching from Yoma, and says that the notion is that God has basically planted in the earth. The plain read of the text, of course, is pillars of the earth, but the idea is that God has sort of planted or put down new trunks and new shoots and new roots of righteous people in the earth. Finally, Rashi. Many, many generations later, the 11th through 13th century, Rashi returns to this teaching, and this is Rashi's direct commentary on the verse in Kohelet itself, V'zarach hashemesh, dor holech v'dor ba. A generation goes and a generation comes. So now what's the change in imagery? What is different here? Dor holech v'dor ba. Yeah. That's interesting. No longer necessarily talking about the righteous, and it's a whole generation who's gone, and then a new generation arises. Marshall, yes. What else is different?
I'm just sort of interested in the languages of Dor Holech.
Mm-hmm.
That means one generation sort of leaves, with Dor Ba, another one comes in. And yet, when you look at the language of Kohelet, that seems to be the opposite language, because Dor Ba means setting.
Great. So Marshall's pointing out that there's an inversion here also, because now we've returned to what I would say is both closer to the conception of Jewish time, post-biblically, and also closer to our lived experience in the world. First of all, because how do Jews conceive of the world? Do we conceive of the world that first the sun rises and then it sets? No. No, we do not. In fact, going back to Bereshit, we don't, right? We actually conceive of it opposite. So this is the perfect place to point out, as Marshall brings up, it's an inversion of the teaching in Ecclesiastes and much closer to the way that we think of the world, right? Vayhi erev, vayhi voker. There was evening and there was morning. Is that what you were going to say, Joey? Baruch shekivanta, right?
And then right before morning, when the person dies, then you do the unveiling.
Different morning, but yes, but a good play on words. So that's one thing that's an inversion. And the other difference is Dor Holech v'Dor Ba is also, I think, our experience in the world. It's not that we experience, a new generation is coming up and then a new generation is gone. The lived experience is a generation goes and then a new generation comes. So Rashi's taken this teaching that comes from 1,500 years prior to him, most likely, and has now expanded it, and we'll talk about the tzaddik part in just a second, and also made it make a little bit more sense per the way that Jews think about time. Just a little bit. Okay. And then says, Kasher hashemesh tizrach shacharit v'tishka arvit v'telech kol halayla. Just as the sun rises in the morning and sets in the evening, and then it goes all night, Sho'efet lashuv el makom asher zarcha etmol misham shetizrach sham gam hayom. And it wants to go back to the place from which it rose yesterday, because it will also rise from there today. I want to linger on this for a moment. Sho'efet lashuv el makom. What wants to return to its place?
Sun.
The sun.
And then what's the figurative thing that wants to return to its place? Righteousness of generation. We have many different conceptions about how Dor Lador operates in Judaism, but Rashi here is entirely the optimist. Rashi says, when a generation leaves, a new generation is going to come. And the notion of tzedek in this world, righteousness, just like the sun is in orbit and will come back around, and there will be people to lead and people to shine, and there will be an understanding that there is good once again and stability once again, right? The thing that we feel when a great generation goes and we think, my God, where is this world headed? Eventually, those kids grow up. Eventually, those kids also have among them righteous people who perhaps God planted. Eventually, we return to that place where the sun is in fact very strong and shining again. I love the optimism that Rashi ends with here. I think that he takes this ancient teaching, which has such a personal notion of the death of a righteous person being individually replaced, and says, no, it's not just that. That may also be true. But beyond that, when a generation is going, we shouldn't wring our hands and say, well, there's nothing to replace it. Yeridat Hadrot, every generation is further from God than the last. Instead, it's like we are in orbit, and the sun will return to the place because that's what it wants. The world that God has created and set in motion is one in which each generation will, in fact, out of a desire, return to a place of righteousness. I really pray that's the world that we live in. I do. Because no matter Whether you sit here today and you feel very old, or you sit here today and you feel very young, the only thing that is true besides the sun for sure rising and setting tomorrow, or setting and rising tomorrow, is that at some point you will be the old generation that is holech, and there will be a new generation, abba, one that is coming in. And to leave this world with the optimism that the generation that is coming will, of course, come back into orbit to that place of righteousness and that place of good and that place of strength is a wonderful way to instill not only a sense of like healed worry within ourselves, but also when it's expressed, can lift up the next generation and say to them that we believe deeply that they're able to carry this on, because of course this is just how the world goes. Their sun will also rise. So thank you for learning with me this afternoon.